initiative to protect our people and our generations to come.
Both of these stories speak to historic injustice, coupled with the complications of climate change. But even Indigenous communities that haven't been coerced into moving face steep challenges, more than others affected by flooding. Lytton Chakraborty researches flood resiliency at the University of Waterloo. He's studied the flooding risks to 985 Indigenous reserves and compared them to other Canadian communities.
Even though flood exposure between Indigenous...
Really been told about the threat they face, and he says that has to change.
Some of the communities, those who are living in the flood zones, or maybe they were pushed to live in some specific areas, they don't have proper information about the risk. So they are not well prepared to mitigate the risk.
Chakraborty says if the government only looks at the physical hazard itself, it's not seeing the full picture. To do the right thing, he says, to truly decolonize risk assessment, officials have to broaden the definition of what risk is for those living on the land. Then there's the wider question. Once you do understand the risks, how do you fix the problem?
I am Deborah McGregor, and I am Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation. I'm also an associate professor at York University at Osgoode Hall Law School in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice.
Deborah McGregor says while Indigenous people in Canada are more vulnerable to flooding, they're also much less responsible for the causes of climate change.
That's what makes it a justice issue. An Indigenous climate justice issue is you are not the one creating the problem, but you are the one who disproportionately bears the impacts of it. That's definitely an issue for Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also elsewhere in the world.
And she says the legal and constitutional framework built up around relations with Indigenous people pretty much guarantees a slow, painful crawl to solutions that would make them safer.
So when I think about my ancestors, for thousands of years, we would have been able to respond in the way that made sense to us because we would have had our own authority, we would have had our own decision making. So in a case of flood or anticipation of fire, you would move from the source of danger. Now it's very challenging to do that.
That's because, in effect, those living on reserves are hemmed in. Their land is under federal control, but the land they need to get to for safety is under the jurisdiction of other levels of government, provincial, territorial, municipal.
So you just can't move like you could have, because then all of a sudden you're leaving federal jurisdiction and then you're engaging with a whole other level of government that isn't historically ever been super keen on taking on the responsibility of First Nations people or Indigenous peoples.
And that means time-consuming challenges for communities trying to prevent or respond to disaster.
Who's got jurisdiction? Who's got funding? And this is going to change across the country. It's not going to be consistent for First Nations when they start to engage with provinces because each province is different. So federally, you'll see support if there's emergency declared, but that's not enough, nor is it local enough to be able to deal with the specific situations. So it does constrain because community can't make a decision because they're sitting there waiting for somebody else to make decisions about how their community is going to be supported through a crisis or an emergency of some kind, as opposed to they having the resources to be able to deal with it right away on their own terms.
Here's a real-life example. That thicket of regulations, layers of bureaucracy, and so many rules has become a jurisdictional nightmare for the Ubiganjik First Nation in northern New Brunswick. That land that it bought on higher ground, the land it once owned, Chief Sasha Labilwa is trying to convert it to reserve land in order to use it.
I'd say there's probably about 50 to 60 steps that need to be taken before an addition to reserve is granted.
50 to 60 steps, and she says everyone has to be on board. It involves negotiating with the federal government, the province, utility companies, and of course the local authorities that may not want to give up the property tax payments.
That's a revenue maybe that municipality is going to lose because once it's granted reserve status, we're not taxable.
The Peguis First Nation in Manitoba has been asking for help for some kind of infrastructure to prevent flooding for years. Member Nagan Sinclair says it is past time for change.
Like, someone's got to pay the bill for what Peguis is experiencing when Canada has created this situation. Canadians should be paying for that. But not only are Canadians paying for that, but Peguis is paying for it as well. Are we going to create a better solution and a better country than we've all inherited? Are we going to find solutions for Indigenous peoples, and particularly for Canadians, to be able to proactively work with Indigenous peoples, not in emergency situations, but in situations in which all peoples of these territories are thriving?
York University's Deborah McGregor says that while Indigenous communities are vulnerable, there's also another side to the story.
I know that the narrative around Indigenous peoples being more vulnerable and at risk, all of that's true, but there's also something else that's true.
Well, as you rightly pointed out, part of the objective of the strategy is to ensure that we find solutions with these communities. So it's not about what the federal government thinks should happen, but it's about figuring out what those strategies, what those solutions are with these Indigenous communities.
And it is, of course, the federal government's responsibility to listen. But Deborah McGregor says the government already knows what communities want.
Indigenous people have already been saying, actually, for quite some time, what they need. Often Indigenous peoples participate in these processes in a very kind of marginal.
It's got answers, ones that point to using Indigenous knowledge as a solution to the climate crisis.
Indigenous people have been talking to the government about what they need. They've written reports, they have done calls to action, they have laid it all out, and it's still being ignored and not implemented to this day. Through my work with ICA, we've done an environmental scan of what has been said to date from Indigenous folks, and there is so much out there. At a point where it becomes exhaustive, saying the exact same thing over and over again. So it's actually not fair to say the government needs to listen to Indigenous people. No, they need to enact all of the calls to action.
So what does a solution look like?
It's respecting Indigenous sovereignty. It's putting Indigenous folks with the knowledge and know-how of their territories in the driver's seat of those solutions. Free, prior, and informed consent with.
We hear a lot about reconciliation and looking forward and how do we improve the overall well-being of Indigenous communities. Well, we're poor in lands because our lands were stolen. We were forced into reservations. I think that's what we need to look at.
with Laura Lynch with CBC Radio 1 and Sirius XM.
And that story first aired in May of 2022, and we want to bring you a few updates. In 2024, the Peguis First Nation filed a lawsuit for $1 billion in flood damages against the federal government, the provincial government, and 2 municipalities located upstream of their community. In the claim, the nation said it's seeking compensation for financial losses and other damages that occurred during a series of floods along the Fisher River. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew visited the community in April of this year, promising to find a solution for the community's flood risk. And in an email, a spokesperson for Indigenous Services Canada says that since the devastating flood in 2022, Ottawa has provided more than $24 million to the Peguis First Nation for flood response, recovery, preparedness, and mitigation. The ministry says it's also been working with the nation to develop a housing plan and to build more homes in the community that would be more resilient to flood. So what better time to revisit another one of our favorite stories about a different way to travel? This one is from the spring of 2023, and it was sparked by a listener question.
I'm Peter Eastope, and I live on North Pender Island. I've always been interested that I've read about and heard about people traveling on freighters. So I'm interested in surface marine travel as an alternative to air travel. For a retired person, a vacation of, say, 6 weeks or 2 months would not be...
Those are, typically the most efficient way to move cargo around. So you want to use that for passenger travel? Sure. I mean, if it's a ship that's already going there, and all you're doing is like an extra crew room that you're in. I mean, you haven't added any energy use to that thing at all, right? It's going to be fine.
But is this even a thing we can do? As it turns out, yes it is. There are several ways to do it. You can try to call a cargo ship company, and depending on their COVID safety regulations, you can see whether you can just jump aboard with their cargo. They may have an extra cabin that you can stay in. But if you want help organizing, there are several cargo ship travel companies, many of them based in Europe, that coordinate everything for you. So let's go back to our listener, Peter. He told me he would be interested in doing a transatlantic cargo ship trip to Europe. Peter would have to get to Halifax and then do a round trip to Antwerp. A Belgian company called Captain Zeppos offers this 37-day trip. On their website, they estimate it'll cost more than $4,000 for that trip. So with that much time, that much cost, who tends to do these trips? I posed that question to Joris van Bray, the owner of Captain Zeppos.
What we offer is time, time away from everything, slow. If people ask me, what can you do aboard cargo ships? I immediately say, nothing. There's nothing to do. The right people, they will say, interesting. I can watch the ocean all day, all night. I can watch the stars. I can just sit there. I can talk to my fellow passengers. I can take pictures. I can read a book. Most of them, they take books. They don't even read because they're too busy with looking and enjoying just being aboard.
Okay, so Joris is obviously hyped on cargo ship travel as much as possible. Here's how he described his cargo ship trip from Italy to the United States.
The cabin was phenomenal. Like, I had been traveling budget backpacking for my entire 4 years of traveling up until that point, and I'd never stayed at a place really that nice. It was...
Paul decided cargo ship travel wasn't for him. And that's the thing. Cargo ships just aren't going to work for most people. So what can we do as individuals? The obvious thing is being more mindful of our travel. Taking a train or bus are greener alternatives. But John Axon says in the long term, we have to be okay with paying more for flights to reflect their environmental impact. Unless you're Peter Easthope from North Pender Island. Then you might seriously consider hopping on a cargo ship. For What on Earth, I'm Rohit Joseph.
Thanks, Rohit. And we always love to hear your climate questions to try to help answer them. And I just think about all the questions that we've had over the last 5 years or so. We've had questions about how to pack a go bag. You just have to leave. Having a no by year, how you do that? Yeah, you can. Figuring out the emissions from an e-bike, or settling the debate about dishwashing or by machine. Oh my goodness, we got so much mail from you about that. You wanted to talk about that. And you can look all of those episodes up and they can get you going all over again. So if you have a climate conundrum that we can help solve, send us an email, earth@cbc.ca, or better yet, send us a voice memo. The email again is earth@cbc.ca. Just go to the local tab and press play wherever you are. You can also find and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Before we go, I want to tell you about a story we're working on here on What on Earth. Wildfire safety measures in Atlantic Canada have become a talking point this year. In particular, Nova Scotia's ban on hiking in the forest. It's faced one high-profile protest, some online pushback, and even got Nova Scotia a mention on the Joe Rogan podcast. Nova Scotia's premier says his province doesn't need the rest of the country or the world to weigh in. But for some Canadians, the conversation about personal freedoms and government overreach goes beyond provincial borders. We'll look into why some people are connecting this debate. Jennifer Wilson, Emma Jean, Nick Logan, Juliana Perkins, Rachel Sanders, Molly Siegel, Matthias Wolfson, and Catherine Rolfson. I'm Laura Lynch. Thank you for listening.
This is CBC Radio 1, 99.1 FM in Toronto. Today on Unreserved.
After 7 albums and a memoir that expressed and explored her grief, loss, and healing, Krista Couture now wants to help others out of the darkness.